So good morning and welcome to today's webinar, The Science Behind HR. I'm Jonathan Englert. I'm a journalist, technologist, and I'm a communications partner with Abilitymap. And today's webinar explores the science behind HR, and we've got Kevin Chandler with us. We're going to discuss with Kev what led Kev to make this breakthrough into the study of detecting productivity features and potential in existing employees, and the transformative effect this can have on the bottom line of almost any organization, from restaurants to engineering firms. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Kevin Chandler. And Kevin is widely recognized as one of Australia's leading human performance innovators. With a background in computer science and organizational psychology, Kevin has spent 4 decades applying science to human resources and revolutionizing hiring and talent management processes across a range of industries. His commitment to replacing subjective measures of performance with objectivity has transformed organizations as disparate as Macquarie Bank, where he played a critical role in its rise as a talent powerhouse, and we're going to be talking about that, and his support of Restoration of the Lakes as one of the world's preeminent golf clubs. He played a principal role also in the creation and growth of Chandler McLeod to $1 billion in annual revenue, and has also chaired numerous commercial and social impact entities. Kevin's unquenchable drive to discover and share the secrets of how organizations can unlock human performance has finally culminated in his role as co-founder and chief science officer of Abilitymap. So what we're going to do today is go on a journey with Kevin, really from his very first observations about HR that ultimately led to a fully fledged science of HR. Without further ado, thanks for joining us, Kev. So let me just kick it off. Why don't we know what we're looking for? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, Jonathan. It's just great to be here talking about what is really my life's passion and what I've made my life's work. And I think you're opening up to talk about what are the fundamentals here that about why HR professionals and C-suite executives, when you ask them, what is it exactly that you're looking for and what's the right qualities of those individuals, you get quite a mismatch of advice coming back to you. So to prepare for this little chat, I thought, well, let's talk about the science. And science is all about looking at the fundamental principles. So if you talk about the fundamental principles that govern workforce behavior in the workplace. And I'd venture to say that the science of HR is really in its infancy when compared with the science in other disciplines. For example, the science in engineering, the science in medicine, in many other fields, IT in particular. And the thing that I find fascinating is that we don't accept the error factors that occur in the HR space that we accept that we see in, say, for engineering, or if in building construction. We want our corners square. We want the building to go up 60 floors. We want everything so it won't fall down. So we're talking in millimeters. But when we come to talk about HR, and I look around and you see, the evidence of poor performance or bad behavior every time you open a newspaper, because you look at, for example, massive overruns from public sector projects. Behind those massive overruns are people making inappropriate decisions or not knowing where things are going. We've got scammers, people who cheat, people who want to put others down. We've got building construction areas which are rife, and if you've ever built a house, that's exactly what you'll find. And you find, so much rework. that goes on. And then the same thing happens when we go into restaurants. You look at the poor performance that you get in some areas, or in sales environments, the poor performance. So what I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is sort of how I went about finding this out. So a few years ago, I started researching how we measure the performance of individuals in jobs. And I came across this question, and I'd like you all to have a think about this. And this is a question for any supervisor of their staff. If you knew at time of hire what you now know, would you rehire? Definitely yes, possibly no, definitely no. And the fascinating thing I found was that about 32% across a wide array of different industries and different job functions would not be rehired. And that's stunning. And Jonathan, you'd appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience would appreciate that. And all you've got to do is look around you. Because one of the questions I often ask people are, have you ever had a boss that you didn't think was competent? And everyone says yes. And I like to say, well, someone hired that person into that job and they didn't expect them to be a poor performer. They made a recruitment error when they found out later that they got the wrong person. Question is, why did they make that error? So that's the fundamental that we're going to sort of be working on, and that's the basis behind ability map. Yeah.
So Kev, it's a stunning figure, right? 32%. And I know as we chatted before the webinar, you said something really stuck in my mind, and it was that if people don't think something can be fixed, right, they often don't try. And when you talk about this distinction between what we're accepting in the workplace as opposed to what we would not be accepting in engineering, and these buildings would be falling down, right? These are massive error rates. How can we possibly accept that level of variability? Because I mean, in the terms of money, productivity, lost opportunities, morale, those costs must be huge. Well, so could you dig down into that a little bit?
Well, I mean, without going to the costs are huge, and we the costs of replacing, the costs of rework, all of that sort of thing. But I think what happens is that when we're looking at others, we're looking at humans, we just see they're so complex. Why are they so different? How can we ever know? It looks like people are like a new frontier when you sit down and try and analyze them. And of course, as a psychologist, we have to cut through that. So throughout my career and with the many psychologists that I've worked with, we have what we call the performance formula. That is, the performance or predictability of performance in a job is a function of two things. So firstly, what person we put into the job, and the second thing is, what are the specific job requirements that we have? So if you think about it, in order to make a good decision about how I'm going to move a person into a job, whether it's for promotion or recruitment, I need to know something about both of those areas. So Sykes, like others have created the measures of KSAAs, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and abilities, and have spent the last 50 years developing assessment tools to the stage where now we know that IQ and personality are factors of performance in every job, depending on the level. And so Sykes have been working on trying to spread that message out to the community. But alongside that, we've got the other half of that equation, which I said, it's PI. Performance is a function of the individual and the environment. The environment's the job. And when you ask, well, how did you identify what the characteristics are in the job? It's very, very loose. So this was a fundamental breakthrough for me when I started to think about ability map. One, our 32%. There's the error factor. That's the problem we're trying to solve. And two, why does that error occur? One, because if you don't use sophisticated techniques on the I side of the equation, you can't get accurate results. But two, on the E side of the equation, most people, most HR professionals do not have a sophisticated, objective, scientifically based strategy for analysing that. And
so Kev, can I just jump in there and say, in testing this, right? I mean, there was a fascinating story he told me about early days of Macquarie Bank, because the idea here is that, performance equals, I think you said performance equals productivity, right? And could you just dig into how that played out in the real world? Because it was a pretty significant and almost historic result. Right?
Well, one of the things here is the changes that you make, you don't see for a year. If you put a poor quality person into a job, you don't see it for a year. So what we need is some longitudinal support for this. And years ago, I had the pleasure of, before David Clark started Ability Map, shouldn't say Ability Map, I wish, started Macquarie Bank. A, he got himself assessed, and B, we sat down and identified what were the underlying characteristics, the capabilities that he wanted in his senior staff, not just his senior staff, in all staff. And so we built a model, what we now call a job profile, which said they've got to be bright, really clever. They've got to be motivated and self-controlled. They've got to be ambitious, organised, disciplined, positive people. So you can see now I'm teasing out the underlying human characteristics. And for the next 25 years, every single person I think there was one but every single person was hired against this kind of model. And what that did, that showed me and gave me the confidence to go out with Mike Earle, my partner, to say, I think we've got an answer here. And the success of the juggernaut that is Macquarie Bank was built from day one. Remembering they started with just 3 people, was built on the fact that they took in individuals who were already identified as being right at the top in terms of the talent pool. So, and isn't that what all organisations are trying to do? We don't set off as a general rule to hire someone who's going to fail at their job.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think this is about, again, the productivity and performance. You get that difference, that significant uptick in productivity, and a huge outcome from that. But I think the problem, though, is identifying, right, what makes a top performer a top performer. I mean, you touched on that from Macquarie Bank, but again, that can go out across all organizations, all industries. How did you go about cracking that problem generally? Then, in terms of the science, in terms of the technology, how does that look?
Well, firstly, I started off thinking, okay, what are the capabilities required in jobs? And capabilities, as we see them, are aggregations of behaviours, like sales performance, or selling, for example, reliability, confidence, these kinds of characteristics. So how do you aggregate them together? So what I did was I built a capability framework that we could then apply across a wide array of different jobs, but knowing that some capabilities, usually only a handful maybe, and in our system we look at 8, usually 4 critical competencies and 4 that are more than desirable, perhaps essential. And then we look to find 8. Now, the most interesting thing, though, is once we've developed the assessment process, we started going out to line managers and say, what do you think drives performance in this job? And a line manager would say, well, here's my 8 competencies. And we had quite a sophisticated system for analysing that. But then you'd go to another manager who knows that and look at the same job, and they would give you a different set of capabilities. Maybe 1 or 2 similar, but a different set. And that meant that when they were making hiring decisions, they were each using a different lens. Problem, they can't both be right. So suddenly we're getting insight into where our 32% comes from. Because in the interview, I see something and I think, oh, that person's, they've got it all. And you see something else, or you compromise, but we're not on the same platform. So if we're not on the same platform, it doesn't matter how good our evaluation of the individual is if we can't match them in. So I'll give you an example. We had a recent case study with a big international software firm, and we asked their 40 sales managers to identify the critical competencies, capabilities required for their BD, for this sales team. And guess what? Out of those 40 managers, we get 40 slightly different characteristics. Now, what we also know is in the sales team, there's significant variability of performance between high and low. And in sales teams, you can see this because you can actually see the dollar differences and how they're performing, which you often can't see in jobs like accounting. You know, is this a good finance director? Well, I don't know. It's the only one that got the job. So I can't tell whether they're at the top of their game, or middle of the game, or they really shouldn't be appointed. Anyway, so we go back and we say we can aggregate a view to the sales managers. This is what we thought you were. But why not use science to then identify more closely what the real characteristics are present in those high-performing sales personnel? So we do that exercise, and guess what? In the sales managers' capability framework that they're using versus the capabilities identified in the high performers, there's not a close match. That means when HR send a candidate in to talk to the line manager, the sales manager, and say, look, here's a very good candidate, quite often the sales manager say, no, they're not right. And all HR managers have had this system come up where they reckon they've got the spec right, and the sales manager says no, or the other manager, whoever it might be. And the reason is they didn't start off with a platform to say, what kind of people are we looking for? So there's a really good example. And that has been reflected virtually over and over again. So this is the critical thing is, if I can identify what the critical competencies are for the job, then I can look at the assessment side. So, but you've got to start with a clear view about what the capabilities are required in the job. And yeah.
But Kev, I mean, so it's clear, right? Now, so it's obvious, I guess, how that could be across all industries, how those kinds of mismatches of perception, subjective judgment, different, et cetera, can just lead to the 32% problem, right? But to address it, you've got the methodology, which you've outlined, right? But the problem is also about scaling, right? I mean, in a sense, it has to be faster and cheaper. It has to be a faster and cheaper way of analyzing the people resources, and then a better way to understand and identify sort of the best, not this hit and miss stuff. So that's probably what leads then to the big transformation in terms of the technology with wide applicability. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Like how does the science translate into the technology?
All of the participants who are following us today would have either been involved or seen new technologies in the HR space. How we can manage large groups of candidates, how we can, and to me, there's many strategies for faster and cheaper. I focus on faster, cheaper, and better. So what do we do to make them better? Well, firstly, we've got to understand why they're not better at the moment. And one, if they don't have this capability evaluation, then you can't get the equation quite right, unless you fluke it. And you do fluke it often. That's for sure. But on the other side, then we've got, well, how am I going to assess the capabilities that I've identified? And the historic strategy, the psychologist, has been to use ability and personality-based questionnaires. Personality-based questionnaires are factor analytic. And for those listening, how do we do that? We get a whole lot of questions, we throw them together, we use our sophisticated analytical tools to see which questions hang together and seem to describe certain kinds of behaviours. So, but we don't know what that behaviour necessarily means, and we don't know whether that behaviour is necessary in the job. So we have to then find an interpretive capability, you know. So we either go out and we get professionals to do that, or we train in-house people to try and do that. Whereas I took a very different approach, and it's called a criterion reference strategy, where we identify the behavioural characteristic that we want to measure, and we work out the best way to measure that characteristic. So it's not just a potpourri of all the personality characteristics that you could have. And this, of course, helps us to overcome some of the subjectivity that there is and the bias that's built in, that the psychs and others just do almost accidentally in terms of how important intelligence is. We know it's important in some jobs, but not important in others. But if you give someone an IQ score, they can read it. And then they say, oh, that'll be bad. We want a different strategy. And our strategy, this criterion reference strategy, says, here's the competencies you look for, and here's how that individual, compared with our broad sample population, how they perform. Therefore, they have the characteristics you're looking for. And that is how we're trying to build a more accurate measurement strategy than the ones that are in place and have been in place for the last 10, 20 odd years, and used generally by psychs and corporates. So this is now what we call next generation HR technology. Yep.
Right. So that technology brings all of that together, right? And then you're still, but you know, we still have businesses continuing to have sort of this high attrition, let's say the high error rate, 32% problem, right? Yep. Can you just give a little, because I'm mindful of time, but I think we've got a little time left. Can you just dig into what it looks like when this technology is actually applied? Okay. What does that look like?
Well, one of the areas that we regularly come across is in the areas of chartered accountants. You know, a big avenue for young graduates coming in. Many of the large internationals are hiring hundreds of young graduates. But then when they get down the track, we find the managers and partners are saying, but the graduates we hired, they didn't actually have the characteristics we wanted. You know, we hired them on their, if you like, their technical competence. That is, they got good academic results. So we hired them on that. But actually, we didn't want that. Well, we wanted that, but we wanted more. And in particular, we wanted communication skills, ability to relate to others, ability to work and be a member of a team, things that didn't get assessed. So we said, well, how would we address that using new technology, using ability map? Well, first thing, you'd say, why don't we look at the individuals who make it through the first 3 years as grads and identify what are the characteristics of high performers for that group? Because the turnover that's already occurred, that people didn't make it, we want to assess the ones who make it to that level. And then we assess individuals who've made it through to senior or manager level. And then we can take it even further and say, well, what are the characteristics of your top manager, of your top partners? And then we can assess an individual coming into the organisation as a young grad and say to the hiring managers, this individual fits this job first, and then has the capacity to step up to manager level and might even make it with the right training and development, because they've got a different set of competencies as well that'll see them through and potentially as partner. And that can revolutionize how we go about our recruiting process and make it so different from the way we go about it today.
Right, because it changes the hit and miss, and it gives you this visibility and this certainty.
Yep.
Yeah, but look, Kev, you brought us on this journey, which is awesome from the beginning when you're first asking us questions through to the technology. I'm thinking, given some time, it might be worth throwing open the floor to some questions. Actually, we have one. There are actually two. Looking at characteristics, two from the same person, apologies. Looking at some characteristics leaves me with two questions. How does this strategy prevent us from hiring the high-performing jerks? I think that's question number one. And maybe, and the second one is, what do we do when the position is new, and even though the gap in the business has been recognized, the full duty of the new position hasn't yet been identified? That's a big one. Why don't we go with the jerks one first?
Okay. Mostly when people talk about jerks, they're talking about people who've got really good academics but fail on the job, or got through an IQ and got a really high IQ and yet didn't perform. And well, let's face it, that's only one element. Jobs aren't successful just because you have one characteristic. Performance in a job is a multivariate issue. You've got to have a combination of a number of different characteristics that lead you. So if you're only measuring and making a decision on one or two, then you're bound to fail. So, right, you are bound to fail, and this is the fallacy of hiring individuals who've only got, quote, high academics or have succeeded in another company in the industry, but and so you hire them on what you see their experience is, but then you think, well, if they were really successful there, why do they want to get out? Why aren't they on a path to go forward? And so many errors there. But the second one is really interesting, and that is, as happens, say, in cyber, right? Now, there's huge shortages of people to come into cybersecurity, and it's not an area that people know well. But when you're looking and saying, what kind of person do I think would be a cyber security specialist, then usually you can look around and say, I can see some individuals that I'm pretty sure could be in that job, because they're already in other jobs. They're in senior IT, they're already in some relevant area, and I can find out and understand something about their underlying characteristics and then build that into my recruitment model. And this is the very essence of the problems that universities have in identifying who are the right people to bring into my undergraduate courses. But you can, as long as you can hypothesize what the underlying skills might need to be, we can build a model of that job that will surpass anything that you've already got, because currently you haven't got anything, and you'd be relying on maybe just their academics, which we've already said, who wants the high performing or low performing, at least highly intelligent academics.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, Kev, I think we could just keep talking. The questions are coming in fast and furious, but we've hit our time. I've got those questions though, so we hopefully will be able to reach out and answer them.
Yep.
I think with that comment and the answer, it's probably a good place to end our webinar today. So on behalf of Ability Map, I want to thank you, Kevin, for your insights, and I want to thank all the guests for attending today. We're going to be recording the session, and it'll be available soon. And don't hesitate to reach out to Ability Map to discuss sort of the power of science and how it might address your job fit problem. And as I said, we'll be answering those questions. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Kevin, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone.